Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second edition of What Went Wrong. Previously, we covered Silverwolf, a unit who was released too early and was built with a design philosophy that the devs eventually had to abandon or made into a common trait. For this edition, we find a unit that isn't too out of place with that notion. Kafka is by far the most popular character out of the first batch of reworked units. For one reason or another, that be with her, design and lore importance, it would be self-sabotage on Hoyo's part to not make Kafka one of the most valuable characters from a gameplay perspective. But as we are now, she is getting a rework due to her lower value, though it's not as simple as Blade where the numbers are too low. Before we get any more sidetracked, let's get started. What went wrong with Kafka? Kafka was released on 1.2 on the same patch as Blade. She was the first ever limited DOT character, and from the start, things were pretty mixed. Kafka was incredibly valuable for one of the most flawed archetypes in the game. DOT has a pretty low ceiling. It can't crit, it's reliant on enemy turns that you really can't enable, and building for DOT makes you inherently squishier without the assurance of defensive measures like, let's say, a Clara. Kafka gets rid of the reliant on enemy turns part, making DOT teams with or without her pretty night and day. Kafka makes DOT able to clear with the options around the early days, but that was also a bit of a concern, her options. Kafka by that point was the most niche limited 5-star. She wasn't as versatile as Silverwolf or Luocha by any metric. It is not optimal for her to use the top two supports, which is Bronya and Ting Yun. Therefore, she was actually weaker than a Zilla or a Jing Yuan. What made her special compared to Jing Yuan and even later on with Jing Liu though, is her second slot. Even to this day, the second slot of DOT teams were very niche. Luca was good for physical weakness, but needed Kafka otherwise, and Sampo barely has any reason to exist in a team without Kafka. Kafka was weaker by the fact that her teams could not use the top options, but because she's strong enough to carry niche options, she leaves your other team lineup free to use busted units. I explained this in my Acheron theorem, but to help better visualize this, if you took two DPS that were better than Kafka, say Blade or Jing Liu on one side each, the problem that arises is that both of those units are doing a tug of war on who gets to choose Bronya as a support. Even if Kafka teams are weaker, Kafka has very few options that overlap with hyper carry, making your average clear time much higher than a Blade or Jing Liu, needing to lag behind for losing Bronya to the other side. This property would be more common in the future for meta teams like Super Break teams, follow-up attack teams, and Acheron teams. Kafka was just the first character to do it, and a sign of what the HSR meta would become with more clear lines of archetype splitting. The early consensus for Kafka was overall mixed though. Some were disappointed she didn't have a more lore accurate kit as she did with her boss fight, some were pretty disappointed that she wasn't a hyper carry, and some were also just not into the fact that Kafka's best teams included men. To give a more legitimate version of that take though, most people find it pretty bad that she used supports that weren't worth building in a team where people were poor on resources. Building Asta and Pela, Bronya or Ting Yun was fine, but building Sampo or Luca knowing he's only going to be in one team due to his lack of versatility was not really something most people were looking forward to. Looking at it from the perspective now with Jiaoqiu and Acheron, I guess some things never really change. But at the end of the day, nobody will deny that if you had the pieces built, Kafka was pretty good. She enables enough damage to clear, and the benefit of freely running hyper carry was a big DPS increase despite being weaker by her own team's merit. Of course, you can't really avoid the eye rolling of using AHR as a nihility, her application of debuffs not being too smooth in multi-target MOCs, and her general backloaded nature as a DOT unit even with her ability. And her future was going to look like it was going to be pretty good too. Her future predictions and value relied upon pretty much one thing: how many DOT units will they release and how good will they be? Realistically, Kafka doesn't really care if her own multipliers fall off, because her detonation scales off other DOTs. Indirectly, in a way, she's kinda future-proof. Even if Kafka herself turns out to be bad, as long as the DOT unit hits hard enough, her enabling will scale off of them. And so, we wait for bated breath until the next DOT character. The releases were slowly piling up until on 1.2 1.6 with the release of Ron May, and a patch later, the release of Black Swan. Throughout the entire history of the game, 2.0 was where DOT was at its peak, and not being joking in any way, this is completely unironic. The strongest team in the metagame was DOT for a very short period of time, going head to head against Jingliu Hypercarry and the slowly rising follow-up attack with Ratio and Topaz, with enemies like Something Unto Death further exacerbating their results in endgame. They would also then fit into the notorious Acheron teams. While not necessarily being the best, it's a really nice option to have, I guess, and you can even run DOT on one side and Acheron on the other side if you prefer. From 1.6 to 2.1 was when DOT had its shining glory, and so what happened with that? Well, a lot happened, but also nothing. That didn't make sense, let me explain it. First, like Several Wolf, Nihility's evolution had a lot to do with it, but in this case, the tinier subsect of DOT. Modern day DOT units are so much better than the old ones by sheer application and uptime. Due to the timing of this change, there are more DOT characters that do not have these modern solutions and end up obsolete. Added with the fact that DOT was not a very flexible archetype in the first place, you were stuck to using Kafka with Black Swan to be anything worth clearing, and I pray for you if you use any of the DOT units before Black Swan. DOT is also one of the least safe to do sustainless runs due to their EHR usage making them really squishy while needing enemy turns for their damage. Also add the fact that you needed to build more important stats like attack and speed, so you can't really cover for defense. Another characteristic Silverwolf shares, funnily enough. DOT had too many issues that other paths didn't really have to deal with. At least Clara can cleanse and reduce damage for her enemy turn reliant playstyle. Zila and everyone else just didn't care about enemy turns at all. So why does only Nihility, specifically DOT, have to suffer this fate? DOT's evolution to match the modes and current meta had to cut off older units at some point. DOT was so bad from the whiteboard that they had to beef it up later just to catch up with paths like Harmonies and Crit Carries that didn't have their issues. Another reason why Kafka hasn't been looked too fondly is because, well, people really didn't have a cheap way to get a good experience playing her. Starrail dramatically slowed down 4-star releases on 2.1 and has been a continuing issue ever since. Coincidentally, 2.0 was the time they began course-correcting DOT's flaws with Black Swan standards like near permanent DOT uptime and stat conversion. And without any 4-star DOT characters after that to have these modern standards, how can you have a good impression of playing DOT? Playing Kafka plus Gwynaifen is too weak and it's going to turn you off from playing or spending on DOT any further. Playing Kafka with Sampo, even worse. The startup cost of using DOT is just way too high. And you can see a way they executed this later with Fei Xiao as an example of how to do this well. With March 7th Hunt and Motsa, it was very easy to see how good Fei Xiao is and build more confidence to invest into her to feel better than the already good accessible 4-stars that she had. In DOT's case, you're basically rammed into pulling Black Swan and Kafka with no budget options. If you don't like it, there's no turning back and do a U-turn, you have to invest a lot of resources into it. People know this and don't even bother looking into a Kafka that needs so much cost to be competitive when others need less for you to try out. DOT's accessibility has always been a problem. Even back when Kafka released, it was a point of contention itself that DOT is so bad on its own that you need a limited 5-star for it to work, which was Kafka. 2 years later and the problem has inflated over time. DOT just isn't accessible enough to get people to want to use it, and thus it's now abandoned with a really bad reputation. Speaking of which, this is the most notorious one that you probably expected. Where even are the DOT characters? Like I said, Kafka, and by extension DOT's value, relies on how much characters there are and how good they are. When the latest DOT unit isn't even meant to do good DOT damage anyway, then what can we do? MOC from Black Swan's release till now has increased HP by more than 90%. Even if Black Swan was broken on release, which she kinda wasn't, at some point we need a new Black Swan to keep up with the archetype. I know they're trying to gear Kafka up for the rework to make her the upgrade, but ultimately Kafka didn't even need one, to be honest. Releasing a powerful enough niche DOT support, maybe a Black Swan upgrade, or maybe even a niche DOT sustain is enough to get Kafka back to the meta placing. That's all there is to it, compared to now that they eliminated 80% of the DOT roster to be anything worth picking, and the only ones left are limited units. It's the most neglected archetype by far. Even after Kafka gets buffed, if all she is still a Black Swan and Jiao Cho enabler, then what's the point? For any archetype in this game to survive, they need fresh characters. Neglecting them like this is just as bad as any nerf, which has been used for balancing since the dawn of time. You can look at the opposite case with Jing Yuan. He kept using meta support so much that he survived the power creep. Doing nothing when HP inflation is a thing is just as bad as a nerf. Even the most broken characters can be toppled off the throne if enough time passes. The lack of releases has hurt Kafka the most, and the neglect her archetype has suffered has turned one of the most popular Star Rail characters into one of the least desirable to pull as a meta player. As for her future, like I said, I don't think the rework will change much if they don't release more DOT characters. If Kafka has a complete role change, then maybe, but I really doubt that they would step over such a unique identity. I think for her rework, she will just detonate more and be SP positive. I don't know, a bigger buff to Kafka is to give her a DOT sustain or a DOT specific support, like Jiao Cho is for Acheron, maybe that level. A 4-star for DOT that actually matches current standards will also make people more partial to Kafka as a taste test. Nevertheless, this was the story of Kafka, a unit who, while they had a mixed start, was a good character. But with the rising tide of the meta, she ended up stranded without any new teams to pull her back to shore. Doing nothing can also be a bad thing, folks. Anyway, I hope you guys like this video. Like, comment, subscribe, do the algorithm stuff. Please join my membership if you want to support me. Thank you especially for Man42 for the highest tier, and I'll see you later. Bye bye.